Have you ever witnessed a moment so unfair, so loaded with judgment that it made your blood boil? It happened in a regular classroom, on a regular Tuesday morning, in a quiet school in the heart of Georgia. A young black boy, no older than 13, sat quietly in the back row. His clothes were worn, his backpack ripped at the seams, and he barely spoke unless spoken to. His presence was barely noticed, except when it became convenient to mock. His math teacher, a man used to being the smartest voice in the room, had grown tired of what he saw as lack of effort. So that day, in front of the entire class, he pointed at the boy. His voice sharp, he said, "Since you never participate, maybe you'd like to show us how smart you really are." The classroom fell silent. Every pair of eyes turned toward the boy, some amused, others sympathetic. He stood up slowly, his face unreadable. The teacher smirked. He wasn't expecting an answer. He was expecting a collapse, a moment to prove his point, to reinforce the hierarchy he believed in. But what happened next would flip everything upside down. Because that boy wasn't just quiet, he wasn't just poor, he wasn't just another face in a school system that constantly underestimated kids who looked like him. He was a prodigy, and no one saw it coming. But before we dive deeper into what happened in that classroom, and how a single moment of humiliation turned into one of the most powerful lessons about racism, judgment, and brilliance hidden in plain sight, I want to ask you something. If this kind of story resonates with you, if it reminds you of the times people were judged by their skin color, by where they came from, or by how much money their parents had, then this video is for you. Please take a second to like this video. It helps bring stories like this to more people who need to hear them. Comment below if you've ever seen or experienced something like this, a moment when someone was wrongly underestimated. And don't forget to subscribe to this channel if you believe that stories like this need to be told again and again until the world finally listens. Now let me take you back to that classroom, to the very moment when silence fell and everything changed. The classroom buzzed with the restless energy of preteen distraction, pencils tapping, sneakers scuffing against linoleum floors, and whispered jokes passing from desk to desk. But when Mr. Ellison, the math teacher, raised his voice, the chaos snapped into stillness. "Micah," he said, loud enough for the entire room to hear, "since you clearly have nothing to add to this lesson, maybe you can solve this equation for us." The equation behind him was complicated, something about quadratic functions and variables stacked like towers on the whiteboard. It wasn't a typical 7th grade problem. It was the kind of question teachers throw out when they're trying to make a point, and this one wasn't about math. It was about power. Micah sat frozen for a moment, caught in that limbo between humiliation and resistance. His eyes scanned the board quickly, then dropped to the floor. His classmates watched, some stifling laughter, others looking away in second-hand embarrassment. Everyone knew Micah came from one of the poorest parts of town. Everyone knew he didn't wear name-brand shoes or come to school with a packed lunch. And most importantly, everyone assumed he wasn't smart. Mr. Ellison leaned against his desk, arms folded, the faintest smirk tugging at his lips. "Go on, show us what you've got." Micah stood up slowly. His hands were trembling slightly, not out of fear, but fury. He had been in this position before. Not just in this classroom, but in stores where security followed him around, in streets where people crossed to the other side, in moments where his silence was mistaken for ignorance. But today felt different. Today, something inside him refused to shrink. He walked to the front of the class, his small frame nearly swallowed by the vastness of the whiteboard. For a moment he just stood there, his back to the room, staring at the equation. A few students snickered. Mr. Ellison cleared his throat, impatient. And then Micah picked up the marker. Without hesitation, without even glancing back at his teacher or classmates, he began solving the equation. His hand moved quickly, confidently. Each step followed the next with surgical precision. He didn't second-guess. He didn't pause. Variables were isolated, expressions simplified, and in less than 2 minutes, the solution stood there, perfectly boxed and undeniably correct. The room was silent. Mr. Ellison's smirk had vanished. His eyes flicked from the whiteboard to Micah, then back again. He opened his mouth to say something, anything, but the words didn't come. Because the truth was written in black ink and undeniable clarity. Micah had not only solved the problem, he had done it faster and more accurately than Mr. Ellison ever expected. A hand shot up from the back. "Is that right?" one student asked, eyes wide. The teacher hesitated. "Yes," he said quietly. It's correct. Micah turned around, and for the first time that day he looked directly at his classmates, not with arrogance, not with anger, but with quiet defiance, the kind that comes from years of being told you're less than, only to prove again and again that you're so much more. He walked back to his seat without a word. The classroom remained silent. What no one knew yet was that this moment, this single act of resistance, was just the beginning. Because Micah wasn't only gifted, he wasn't only brilliant, he was about to change everything. Before that moment in the classroom, before the equation and the stunned silence, Micah was just a shadow to most of his peers, a quiet figure slipping in and out of school days, barely noticed. But if you followed him beyond the school's walls, past the cracked sidewalks and chain-link fences of his neighborhood, you'd find a story that few ever cared to ask about. Micah lived with his grandmother, Miss Ruth, in a small one-bedroom apartment on the third floor of a weathered brick building in South Atlanta. His mother had passed when he was 7. His father had never been in the picture. Miss Ruth, a retired nurse with strong hands and a stronger spirit, had taken Micah in without hesitation, raising him with more love than money. Their apartment was always warm, not from the heater, it barely worked in winter, but from the scent of cornbread and collard greens, from the laughter Miss Ruth insisted they share at the end of each day, and from the soft gospel music playing through an old dusty speaker. There were no luxuries, no high-speed internet, no private tutors, but there was something more valuable: resilience. Micah had learned early on that the world didn't expect much from boys who looked like him. Dark skin, quiet eyes, hand-me-down shirts. Teachers often looked past him. Strangers talked over him. Policemen drove slowly past their block, watching, waiting. But what those people didn't know was that Micah had a gift, and not just a talent for numbers, but a hunger to understand them. While other kids played video games or streamed cartoons, Micah spent hours flipping through old math workbooks Miss Ruth had found at a thrift store. He'd watch free online lectures when the Wi-Fi worked and scribble down problems in notebooks already filled to the margins. Patterns spoke to him. Equations calmed him. In a world full of noise and uncertainty, math gave him a language that never lied. Miss Ruth noticed it early on. She'd wake up in the middle of the night and find Micah sitting at the kitchen table, a flashlight in hand, scribbling furiously. She would just smile and go back to bed. "That boy's got lightning in his brain," she'd often say to the neighbors. But genius doesn't always come with recognition, especially when wrapped in the body of a poor black child from the South. No one at school ever asked Micah about his interests. No one noticed that he was always the first to finish exams, that his scratch paper was filled with formulas no 7th grader should even know. He was invisible, and sometimes he preferred it that way. It was safer. Until Mr. Ellison decided to put him on display. What Mr. Ellison didn't realize was that Micah had been preparing his whole life for moments like this, not just through equations, but through the weight of expectations, the sting of being overlooked, and the fire of proving people wrong without saying a word. The night before that classroom showdown, Micah had been working on college-level calculus problems, his fingers smudged with pencil lead, his face lit only by a flickering lamp. Not because someone assigned it to him, but because he wanted to understand the world better, piece by piece, formula by formula. Because somewhere deep inside, he believed that if he could just crack the code, if he could just become undeniable, then maybe, just maybe, the world would have to stop ignoring boys like him. Mr. Ellison wasn't the kind of teacher who yelled or threw markers. He wasn't openly cruel. On the surface, he was what most would call strict but fair. But for students like Micah, his fairness often came with conditions and invisible walls. He rarely called on Micah unless it was to make a point. He never praised him, never asked what he needed, never acknowledged his potential. Instead, he measured Micah through assumptions: poor effort, low performance, absent father, troubled background, the kind of quiet biases that never make headlines but shape lives all the same. This was the kind of racism that didn't need slurs. It dressed itself in professionalism. It smiled, it claimed to be helping, but it operated through lower expectations, constant suspicion and subtle dismissals. And Mr. Ellison wasn't alone. He was a mirror of a system that routinely underestimated black children, especially boys, unless they performed above and beyond. Micah felt it every day, not just from Mr. Ellison, but from the hall monitors who always checked his pockets, from the school security guard who watched him too closely, from the counselors who told him to consider a trade school before even asking what he dreamed of becoming. Every compliment came with surprise. "You're so articulate. "You're so well behaved," as if it was a marvel for someone like him. But in Mr. Ellison's class, the mask of neutrality slipped more often. When other students forgot their homework, it was a mistake. When Micah did, it was laziness. When a white student struggled with a concept, Mr. Ellison patiently re-explained. When Micah struggled, he was told to catch up. And then there were the jokes. Quiet, under the breath, always said just loud enough. "You planning to major in math or music videos? Hope you didn't leave your calculator in the pawn shop." Students laughed. Micah didn't, but he remembered every word. These weren't isolated incidents. They were patterns. They were the air he breathed every time he walked into school. And the worst part? Mr. Ellison believed he was doing his job. He believed he was maintaining order. He believed he was preparing kids for the real world. But what he was really doing was reinforcing a lie, that some students belong and others don't, that intelligence has a color, that poverty means failure, that quiet means incapable. Micah's silence wasn't weakness, it was survival. He learned long ago that challenging authority could backfire, that teachers could twist your words. That once labeled as difficult, doors started to close. So he kept his head down even when his mind burned with answers. But humiliation has a tipping point. When Mr. Ellison called him out in front of the class, it wasn't just another insult. It was a declaration, a public stripping of dignity disguised as a learning opportunity. And that's why it mattered so much when Micah solved the problem, not just for the grade, not just for himself, but as a quiet rebellion against everything Mr. Ellison represented. Because every time someone like Mr. Ellison used their authority to diminish a child, they weren't just enforcing rules, they were enforcing roles. They were deciding who gets to rise and who stays invisible. Micah shattered that script. In a system that tried to make him small, he chose to be seen, and in doing so, he exposed a truth too many refused to face. Sometimes the people in charge of shaping young minds are the very ones holding them back. Long before that classroom showdown, Micah's brilliance had been quietly blooming, hidden behind silence, poverty, and stereotypes. He wasn't the type to raise his hand. He didn't interrupt, didn't boast, didn't correct teachers when they were wrong. But while the world overlooked him, Micah's mind worked at a speed few could imagine. He had discovered his love for numbers by accident. One night when he was 8, the power went out in their building. Miss Ruth lit candles and pulled out a deck of flashcards from a donation box someone had dropped off that morning. They sat at the kitchen table, laughing and quizzing each other. Multiplication, division, fractions. What started as a game became something more. Micah began solving the cards faster than Miss Ruth could read them. She paused and stared. "You got a clock in your head, baby?" Micah just grinned. From that moment on, Miss Ruth made sure he had what little she could gather: old math books, puzzles from the library, printed worksheets from a friend at church who worked at a local school. They weren't new or fancy, but to Micah they were treasures. He devoured them like novels, solving problems meant for kids 3, 4, even 5 years older than him. But none of that brilliance showed up on his school record. He never bragged. He rarely asked questions. His homework, when turned in, was neat but unremarkable, because he didn't want to stand out. And truthfully, he didn't think anyone cared. Teachers treated him like another name on the attendance sheet. No one noticed the scratch paper in his backpack filled with complex equations. No one saw the notebook where he taught himself algebra by watching YouTube videos on a neighbor's borrowed Wi-Fi. It wasn't just a talent, it was a sanctuary. Math didn't judge how you dressed. It didn't care about skin color. It didn't laugh when you walked into class alone. Numbers were constant, predictable, fair. They obeyed the same rules for everyone, even if the world didn't. Micah kept his gift to himself, partly out of fear and partly out of habit. He had seen what happened to kids who were too smart, too confident, especially if they were black and poor. They were mocked, labeled show-offs, even punished for challenging the norm. So he stayed quiet, letting others assume he wasn't capable. What no one realized was that Micah was already solving equations high school students struggled with. He could factor polynomials in his head. He understood the beauty of symmetry in graphs. He saw connections between patterns that others missed entirely. His mind was wired not just to calculate, but to see. Miss Ruth tried to advocate for him. She once wrote a note to his teacher, asking if Micah could be given more advanced material. The teacher never responded. Another time, she showed up at a parent-teacher conference with a folder full of Micah's work, handwritten proofs, self-taught geometry. Mr. Ellison glanced at it, smiled politely, and said, "We'll see what we can do." Nothing ever changed. Because in schools like Micah's, brilliance isn't always enough. Not when it wears thrift store sneakers, not when it lives in a part of town most teachers avoid after dark, not when it doesn't look like the gifted students they expect. So Micah kept his genius hidden, like a secret, like a weapon he didn't yet know how to use, until the day Mr. Ellison gave him no choice, until the moment he was called out, not knowing that the boy he was trying to embarrass was capable of solving problems he himself might struggle with. Micah didn't just solve that equation out of pride, he did it to remind himself and everyone watching that his mind had always been worthy, even if no one had ever told him so. It started with a sigh. Mr. Ellison had just explained a new concept, graphing quadratic equations, and as he turned back to the whiteboard, he caught Micah staring out the window. It wasn't disrespectful. Micah was thinking, visualizing, lost in his mind's eye where parabolas arced across invisible axes. But Mr. Ellison didn't see a thinker, he saw defiance. "Micah," he barked, "am I boring you?" The classroom froze, heads turned. Some students grinned, already sensing trouble. Micah blinked, pulled back into the moment. "No, sir." "Then maybe you can tell us what the vertex of this parabola is," Mr. Ellison snapped, pointing to a fresh equation hastily scrawled across the board. It was complex, an unusual form that most of the class hadn't even learned yet. Micah hesitated. He knew the answer, but he also knew what was happening. This wasn't a real question. It was a trap. Mr. Ellison wasn't trying to teach, he was trying to humiliate. The room grew thick with silence. Mr. Ellison took a step forward. "Come on. You think you're too smart to pay attention? Prove it." Micah stood slowly. His palms were sweating. He could feel 30 pairs of eyes on him, some waiting for him to fail, others silently begging him to walk away. But this time something cracked. It wasn't anger, it was exhaustion. Exhaustion from years of shrinking himself to survive. Exhaustion from pretending he didn't know the answer, just to make others comfortable. Exhaustion from carrying brilliance in a world that expected so little from him. He walked to the front, his steps steady. He didn't ask for permission. He didn't wait for approval. He picked up the marker. Mr. Ellison crossed his arms, waiting for the stumble, the confusion, the blank stare. But it didn't come. Micah's hand moved with purpose. He rewrote the equation cleanly, lined up the terms, and began simplifying. Students leaned forward in their seats. Mr. Ellison's smirk twitched. Micah found the vertex using the formula, double-checked his steps, and circled the answer. Then, without a word, he drew the graph, sketching the curve with precision and labeling every axis. He stepped back. Done. The room stayed silent. Mr. Ellison cleared his throat, trying to regain control. "Well, let's see if that's correct." He checked each step, twice, and each time his face hardened. There were no mistakes. Finally, he nodded stiffly. "Correct," he muttered. Micah didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply put the marker down and turned toward his seat. And that's when Mr. Ellison, unable to accept the truth in front of him, said something that would change everything. "Maybe next time try showing that kind of effort on your homework instead of pretending to be some kind of genius." A gasp swept through the room. Even the students who didn't particularly like Micah flinched. He stopped in his tracks. Those words weren't just dismissive, they were venomous. They told the class that what they'd just seen didn't matter, that brilliance from a poor black kid could always be reduced to attitude or luck, that no matter how perfect his work was, his worth would still be questioned. Micah didn't speak. He didn't need to, because in that moment the humiliation didn't belong to him anymore. It belonged to the teacher, who had just tried to bury genius beneath a pile of stereotypes. And while Mr. Ellison stood there, arms still crossed, clinging to his authority, a quiet realization was dawning among the students. Micah wasn't who they thought he was. He was something far more dangerous to the system than a rebel. He was undeniable, and nothing was ever going to be the same. Micah sat down slowly, but he wasn't the same boy who had stood up moments before. Something inside him had shifted. He had just been publicly dismissed after proving something incredible. Instead of praise, he'd been mocked. Instead of acknowledgement, he was told to try harder. But rather than shrink back into himself like he'd done so many times before, Micah made a choice. He would no longer hide. That afternoon he stayed after class, not because he wanted to argue, but because he needed to make something clear. While the other students filed out, whispering about what they'd just witnessed, Micah walked up to Mr. Ellison's desk. The teacher didn't look up at first, clearly expecting an apology or excuse. "I want harder work," Micah said. Mr. Ellison blinked. finally looking at him. "I already know the material you're teaching," Micah continued. "I've taught myself algebra. I've started on pre-calculus. If you're serious about teaching, then teach me something new." There was no anger in Micah's voice, just calm clarity, and it stunned Mr. Ellison, not because of the request, but because of who it was coming from. In that moment, the image he had of Micah, lazy, unmotivated, unremarkable, collapsed, but instead of responding with openness, Mr. Ellison recoiled. "Maybe you should focus on passing this class first," he said flatly. Micah didn't flinch. "I already have. I've gotten every question right this semester. You just haven't noticed." Then he turned and walked out. That act, small as it may seem, was resistance in its purest form. Not loud, not violent, but bold and undeniable. Micah refused to accept the narrative written for him. He refused to let ignorance dress itself as authority, and it didn't stop there. Over the next few weeks, he began asking harder questions in class. He stayed after school to use the computer lab, digging into online college math lectures. He started tutoring other students, quietly at first, then more openly. Those who used to ignore him now came to him for help. At lunch, a few students began sitting with him, curious to know how he had learned so much on his own. Micah shared his methods freely. He didn't care about credit. He cared about truth, about showing others what was possible. Word began to spread. Teachers from other departments started hearing about that kid who solved the impossible equation. One of them, Ms. Alvarez from the science wing, stopped him in the hallway. "I heard about what happened," she said gently. "If you ever want to join our STEM club, we'd be lucky to have you." It was the first time a teacher at that school had spoken to Micah like he was someone who mattered. And yet, Mr. Ellison remained unchanged. He stopped calling on Micah. He pretended the incident had never happened. But the silence only made Micah's presence louder. His excellence was no longer hidden. It couldn't be ignored. Micah wasn't trying to prove himself to Mr. Ellison anymore. He was proving something to himself, that he didn't need permission to be great. That being underestimated wasn't a curse. It was an opportunity, that his mind, his voice, his presence, all of it had power. And slowly the classroom began to change. Other students, ones who had also been written off, started speaking up. They asked more questions. They challenged answers. They believed, maybe for the first time, that they were allowed to be brilliant too. Micah had lit a fuse. What began as a single act of defiance had become a quiet revolution. When Micah returned to class the next day, the room felt different. Students who used to glance past him now looked up when he walked in. A few nodded. One even moved their backpack off a chair next to them, offering a seat with a small gesture of respect. But Micah sat in his usual place, back corner, second row from the window, quiet and steady, as if nothing had changed, yet everything had. Whispers rippled across the classroom before the bell rang. "Did you see what he did yesterday, Mr.?" Ellison didn't even know how to respond. Micah's like actually a genius, but when Mr. Ellison entered, the energy shifted again. He walked in with his usual clipped steps, expression unreadable, eyes scanning the room without landing on anyone in particular. He gave the morning instructions and began the lesson like clockwork, pretending the previous day's confrontation had never happened. But the class remembered, especially when he began writing another complex problem on the board, this time even more advanced than the last. He turned to the students, marker in hand. "Anyone want to give it a try?" Silence. All eyes flicked toward Micah. Mr. Ellison noticed and hesitated. For a second he looked directly at Micah, then quickly away. He didn't call on him. He moved on, solving the problem himself. But his confidence was thinner now. Each step on the board more cautious, more deliberate. For the first time, the silence in the room wasn't about fear of being wrong. It was about the unspoken acknowledgement that the smartest person in the room might not be the one holding the marker. Micah watched quietly, his expression unreadable. He didn't speak up. He didn't correct mistakes. But when Mr. Ellison stumbled in his explanation, mixing terms, reversing a sign, Micah caught it. So did a few others. One student raised a hand. "I think that's supposed to be -5, not positive." Mr. Ellison paused. "Right, good catch." But his eyes flicked back to Micah for a split second. He knew. The power dynamic had shifted. It wasn't about control anymore. It wasn't about discipline or obedience. It was about truth. And the truth had been exposed in front of 30 students. Micah wasn't just capable. He was exceptional. And now no one could pretend otherwise. Later that week, something remarkable happened. The principal, Dr. Harris, visited the class unannounced. She stood in the doorway as Mr. Ellison taught, observing silently. When the lesson ended, she asked to speak with Micah in the hallway. The students watched in curiosity as Micah followed her out. No one knew what the conversation was about, but when he returned, his expression was different, focused, calm, and when he sat down, Mr. Ellison didn't speak. He looked away, because silence has weight. And that classroom was full of it. The silence of realization, the silence of reckoning, the silence of a system being quietly dismantled by the very student it tried to ignore. From that day forward, Micah's presence in the room carried a new kind of gravity. He still didn't speak often. He still didn't raise his hand unless necessary. But every time he did, the room listened. The students leaned in, and Mr. Ellison, once the center of authority, found himself on the edge. Micah had done something few others had. He hadn't shouted. He hadn't demanded. He had simply revealed the truth so powerfully that no one could look away. And in that silence, thick with awareness and tension, a new kind of voice emerged, one that didn't need volume, only clarity. The day after the principal pulled Micah from class, a quiet buzz moved through the school halls like static electricity. Something had shifted, but no one could quite name it yet. Then came the announcement. During the school's morning assembly, normally reserved for birthdays and sports updates, Principal Dr. Harris stepped up to the mic with a rare expression of pride. "I want to take a moment to recognize a student whose talent has recently come to light in a truly extraordinary way," she began, scanning the crowd. "Micah Thompson," gasps, whispers, every head turned toward him, seated in the back row of the gymnasium. Micah sat frozen for a second, unsure if he'd heard correctly. Dr. Harris continued. "Micah has not only demonstrated exceptional mathematical ability here at school, but he has also been participating in online national math competitions and winning. For the last 2 years, the room erupted. Students looked around in disbelief. Even teachers turned to each other, mouths slightly open. No one had known. No one had asked. Dr. Harris held up a printed certificate. "This is just one of several awards Micah has earned, quietly on his own time, without tutoring, without formal support, just raw dedication and brilliance." Mr. Ellison, seated near the faculty, sat completely still. It was all true. Micah had been entering virtual math Olympiads and problem-solving contests for advanced students across the country. Miss Ruth had helped him register using her old email address. He used borrowed laptops, borrowed Wi-Fi, and a fire that couldn't be borrowed, only born. He had placed in the top 5 nationally in a middle school competition months ago. He had solved logic puzzles faster than some high school seniors, but he had never mentioned it to anyone at school. Why would he? No one had ever asked who he was beyond the surface, until now. Dr. Harris invited him up to the front. Reluctantly, Micah stood, walking through the aisle as students clapped, some cheering, others still processing the reveal. He didn't smile, not fully, but there was a quiet glow in his eyes, the kind of glow that comes not from pride, but from finally being seen. When he reached the stage, Dr. Harris didn't just shake his hand. She handed him a letter, a scholarship application packet. From a prestigious math academy in Washington, D.C., she leaned in and whispered, "They've already seen your work. They want to meet you." The room fell back into silence, because in that moment Micah became more than the quiet kid from the back of the class. He became a symbol of what happens when potential is ignored because it doesn't fit expectations, a symbol of brilliance buried by bias. And in the back row, Mr. Ellison sat like a statue, his eyes locked on the boy he had mocked, dismissed, underestimated. No excuses now, no justifications. Micah's success wasn't a fluke. It was a pattern that had been visible the whole time, if anyone had bothered to look past poverty, past skin color, past assumptions. Later that day in the teacher's lounge, the murmurs began. Did you know? Why wasn't he in the gifted program? How did we all miss this? But the questions came too late because the truth had already taken the stage. And now everyone had to reckon with the fact that the system built to recognize talent had completely failed someone who had it in abundance. Micah didn't say much after the assembly. He just returned to class, opened his notebook, and continued solving equations as he always had. But now the world was watching, and Mr. Ellison, for once he had nothing to say. Recognition came fast. After the school assembly, Micah's story spread beyond the walls of the classroom. Parents began calling the front office, asking if it was true, if the quiet boy from the lower income block had really been competing at a national level in mathematics. Some were skeptical, others were furious, not at Micah, at the system that had nearly buried him. Within a week, a local newspaper picked up the story. South Atlanta student shocks school with math genius. The article mentioned his online competition wins, his scholarship offer, and, more subtly, the fact that his abilities had gone unnoticed for years. By then, students were rallying around Micah. They asked him for help with their homework. They started seeing him not as the quiet poor kid, but as a leader. Even teachers from other grades stopped by his classroom to introduce themselves, congratulate him, and offer materials or mentorship. But in the midst of all the praise, one figure remained noticeably silent. Mr. Ellison. He didn't congratulate Micah. He didn't speak of the assembly. He taught class as though nothing had happened, even as the other students' respect for him began to erode. Whispers spread. Why didn't Mr. Ellison ever tell us Micah was that smart? Didn't he know? What kind of teacher ignores a student like that? Then came the school board meeting. Micah's grandmother, Miss Ruth, had been invited to speak, something she never imagined doing. She stood in front of the microphone, her voice trembling but proud. My grandson taught himself college math, while this school barely noticed him, she said. He didn't need special treatment. He just needed to be seen. But instead he was dismissed, doubted, and even humiliated. Silence fell over the room. Several parents stood up and demanded answers. One mother said, "If this happened to Micah, how many other students are being overlooked right now?" An investigation into teacher evaluations was quietly initiated. Mr. Ellison was called in for a closed-door meeting with the principal and a district supervisor. Nothing was made public, but after that meeting he began to change, not dramatically, but noticeably. He stopped using sarcasm in class. He stopped targeting students for attention. He started checking in with kids who had once faded into the background, asking them what they were interested in, what they needed help with. It wasn't redemption, but it was something. Still, for many students, the damage had been done. The image of Mr. Ellison as the unquestioned authority figure had cracked. They'd seen how quickly he dismissed someone exceptional because of his own assumptions, and they wouldn't forget. As for Micah, he never gloated. He never rubbed his success in anyone's face. When students asked how he learned so much, he simply said, "I just kept going." His humility only made the respect grow. At the next student awards ceremony, Micah was the final name called. The auditorium filled with applause as he walked across the stage to receive a special certificate of recognition, not just for academic excellence, but for resilience. He looked out over the crowd. So many faces that once ignored him, laughed at him, looked through him. Now they were clapping. And in the back of the room, even Mr. Ellison stood slowly. Their eyes met. No words were exchanged. But in that moment, the power had shifted entirely. Micah wasn't just seen now, he was respected. And for the first time in a long time, he felt what so many other kids like him rarely do in a system built to hold them back. Validation. Not because he had finally changed, but because the world finally caught up to who he had always been. In the weeks and months that followed, Micah's story continued to ripple through the school and beyond. What had started as a single confrontation in a math class had transformed into something much bigger, a reckoning, not just with one teacher's bias, but with an entire system's blindness. People love to talk about talent. They love the idea of brilliance, of potential, of gifted children changing the world. But too often that love is conditional. Conditional on how you look, where you live, how much money your family makes, how well you fit into expectations. Micah didn't fit the mold. He didn't speak loudly. He didn't wear expensive clothes. He didn't come from a family that donated to school programs or had connections to Ivy League alumni. He was just a boy with a gift, and a world that never expected to find that gift in someone like him. And that's the tragedy, isn't it? Genius isn't rare. Opportunity is. How many Micahs are sitting in classrooms right now, being ignored because their brilliance doesn't come packaged in the way the world recognizes? How many kids are shrinking into silence because they've been told, directly or indirectly, that their voices don't matter? Micah's story forced people to look in the mirror. Teachers began asking harder questions about their own assumptions. Administrators revisited policies on identifying gifted students. Parents started having different conversations at home about race, potential, and equity. But Micah didn't care about being a symbol. He just wanted to do math. He continued preparing for his transition to the scholarship program in Washington, D.C., meeting weekly with mentors, receiving new materials, and, most importantly, finally learning at the level he had always been capable of. Miss Ruth still packed him dinner when he studied late. She still called him her little lightning brain. And though she never said it outright, she knew this wasn't just about one boy's success. It was about changing what was possible for every child who had been written off too soon. As for Mr. Ellison, he remained at the school. He was quieter now, more careful with his words. Some believed he had been humbled. Others believed he was simply waiting for the attention to pass, but it didn't. Because every time someone mentioned gifted programs, someone brought up Micah. Every time a student was told they didn't seem like the type, someone asked, "What type is that exactly?" Micah became the question that lingered, the proof that potential can't be predicted by zip code or skin tone, the reminder that even the brightest minds can be dulled, not by lack of ability but by lack of belief. And maybe that's the lesson that matters most. Not that Micah was a prodigy, but that we should never need a prodigy to prove that every child deserves to be seen. So the next time a quiet kid sits in the back of a classroom, eyes low, clothes worn, voice soft, remember Micah. Remember what happens when you choose to look deeper, because brilliance is everywhere. You just have to be willing to see it. If this story moved you, even just a little, don't let it stop here. Subscribe to this channel if you believe that voices like Micah's deserve to be heard, that stories of resilience, injustice, and transformation need a place in the spotlight. Like this video so the algorithm doesn't bury yet another powerful truth beneath noise. And most importantly, leave a comment below. Write, "I see you," if you believe every child, regardless of race or background, deserves to be seen, heard, and uplifted. Because when we engage, we amplify. When we speak, we protect. And when we listen, truly listen, we begin to change the world one story at a time. If this video spoke to you, there's another one on the screen right now that you need to see. Watch it next. Your attention matters, and so do the lives behind these stories.